presentation.
Good afternoon, Jessica, Koifan, as well as friends of Michigan Engineering Semester 4. Today we are going to present the final exam of our logistics supply chain management beer game presentation report.
Okay, so moving on to the data collection and processing. At the top picture, it is the result of non-policy session from all the participants. Now the graph shows the performance of each participant when they participating in the first session, and then the lower picture is a global result of the non-policy session. Now from the picture, there can be observed that the total cost required through the supply chain is reaching approximately $14,000. At some point, there is a backlog with one of the stakeholder, and that caused an understock. So this is the second session. The top picture is the result of the session with policies for all participants. And for the global result, and then the lower picture is the global result of session with policies. Now the graph shows that the global result from the session, that the cost throughout this session is reaching approximately $20,700. In some point, there can be observed that there is some backlog occurring in one of the stakeholder, but the amount of backlog is not very high compared to the first session.
Okay, so moving on to the analysis, the difference between the first session and the second session, the comparison. So for the without policies, here we put several parameters, which are the retailer maximum backlog, retailer maximum cost, retailer cost, and so on and so forth, up to the aggregate cost. It is clearly that the aggregate cost is much more expensive in the game without policies, which reaches up to twice the total cost of the game without policy with policies. This happens because of several reasons. The first reason is because as the policies are implemented, each and every stakeholder's backlog decreases. For example, in the retailer, the maximum backlog without policies is 13. Except for the retailer. However, for the others, the backlog decreases. For instance, in the wholesaler, without policies, the maximum backlog reaches 55. However, with policies, the maximum backlog reaches 18 only. And then the number of stocks decreases in the game with policies, as now all stakeholders implement the maximum number of stocks on hand, and this helps to decrease the inventory holding costs than before. Also, as now the orders are limited, they tend to have a constant number, unlike in the previous game. Also, in the second game, Jopi, can you move one slide backward? In the second game, it can be seen that the number of orders is quite similar from one and another, and the bullwhip effect is clearer in the second game rather than in the first game without the policies, because of the policies implemented. I think that's all from our group.
My first question, is backlog can be maintained? Because you put over here like maximum 20, maximum 15, or actually backlog happens automatically?
If, for example, we have already 15 backlogs,
Okay.
we try to avoid, for example, with the retailer, we have maximum 20 backlogs. We try to avoid reaching above 20 like that.
Okay. But my question is like this. If the backlog exceed, for instance, for the retailer, the backlog exceed than 20, but you set the order of maximum 10, is there going to be any changes for the maximum order capacity over here? So for instance, in here you assume that the maximum number of the backlog is 20, right?
Yeah.
We try to you try to avoid the backlog not exceeding than 20, right?
Yeah.
Now my question: what if the backlog is exceeding than 20? However, your maximum order capacity is only 10. Are you going to change the policy over here? The maximum of order of 10, or how you're going to manage to that particular kind of situation?
Iya, harusnya kalau itu mau nggak mau di policies have to be broken, Ko Ivan. Tapi kemarin when kita main sih nggak pernah kejadi kayak gitu ya. Jadi
nggak pernah terjadi kayak gitu.
iya.
Okay. Now, I think that's for my group question. Now I have individual question. Okay. Each one who can answer the question will get additional 5 points. Okay. For both the group, for both the report and the presentation score, they will have additional 5 points for each question. Now, my first question is like this. Why do we need to play around 50 weeks over here? What's the purpose we set into
I can answer
set the playing time for around 50 weeks? Okay, Pascal, what's your answer?
Because 50 weeks is nearing to the 52 weeks of a time, and sometimes a year can be representative of how the things can be changed, can be observed, because while maybe 100 weeks is much more has lower standard deviation, 50 weeks has the most realistic way to represent how everything could be seen, because in like most companies, the monetary fiscal report, like the production, then the forecasting, all happen in a year period, and almost of them are around 50 to 50 weeks. So 50 weeks in the beer game could be seen as the most realistic thing that could happen.
Okay, thank you guys for your presentation. And then let's move on to the next group. For the next group, you may start your presentation.
Good afternoon. Today my group will be presenting about our beer game study. So, for the first game, it was already mentioned a few times previously that there are two things. First, we did not implement any policy whatsoever, so everything remains constant and we are free to do as we wish. And then the second was that we're not allowed to communicate with each other. So we have no knowledge whatsoever what is going on in each other's region, per se. So the first part is that we actually need to look at the pieces of the order that are fulfilled. From the retailer, there are 56 pieces. From the wholesaler, 131. Distributor for 77, and the manufacturer is 229. Which is actually not surprising, as the manufacturer actually needs to fulfill a lot of orders due to the need from the retail, wholesale, and distributor. Moreover, there are delay orders in the first game, as there are no policies whatsoever. And the highest one, it comes from distributor, 121 pieces of delay order. And then there's also the largest order of 99 pieces is in week 13, which comes from the manufacturing. And then the total cost in the supply chain flow is 78,355 euros, which is actually quite a high cost. So we can actually look from the first graph here, which is the global results. Let me just zoom it in for you guys. So here actually is our global results. So this represents our stock, our orders, and our cost. As we can see, there is not really a lot of balanced relationship between the stock and the orders, especially the fact that the stock actually decreases for a while, but it increases sharply, which actually accentuates the bullwhip effect that actually exists here. And then along with the stock levels that eventually decrease to only 0, it means that there's actually something wrong there, especially if all of the players actually already only have 0. So of course, with the bullwhip effect, with the increasing cost, it is of no surprise it would actually eventually rise to a high cost level, which is 78,355 euros. Now, how can these individual actions affect this? This is because of this is actually our individual results. So as we can see, the problem that we most have is are two things. The distributor and the manufacturer, due to the sharp increases that each has, as well as the constant number of orders that it needs to fulfill towards the end. The one that's actually the least worrying is actually the retailer, where there's a great balance between the increases and the decreases in terms of the order sizes. But eventually, in everything here, all of the cost increases, but the one that's actually most worrying is actually the manufacturer, where the cost increases sharply, but in a constant manner. I'm sorry, how do I go? Okay. So the retailer has 5,810 euros, for wholesaler 14,215 euros, distributor 26,460 euros, and manufacturer is the highest one, which is 33,575 euros. Now we're going to move to the second game. So this actually I have to explain a bit for the implementation of the following policies. We have 5 here. The stock level must be below 100. This was actually based on our experience with the previous game, where the stock level is actually quite high at times, and it went out of control. So we need to limit it to only below 100, as it is difficult but realistic and can be achieved. Same goes to the backlog rounds. For the backlog and the outgoing order, the rounds 1 to 20 are different 20 to 40 because of the difficulties as time progresses. For the backlog rounds, it is quite difficult to, as time progresses, it is becoming more and more difficult to limit the backlog. So eventually we have to make some concessions, which means that we have to make the differences here. And this actually has a great effect, the policies, the implementation of the policies in our second game, because from just 78,355 euros, we managed to move to 23,990 euros. And this effect is greatly felt in with the manufacturers, where it decreased from 33,575 euros to only 8,930 euros. This actually is aided with the Go overall results graph, where as compared to the previous one, where it's actually quite sharp, the differences in sharp increase and decreasing, it's more balanced here, even though there is actually an accentuation that increases here and there. And this actually also greatly felt. It's also greatly felt in the individual roles here, especially with the retailer, where it's more balanced, wholesaler, distributor, manufacturer as well.
So playing beer games with policies. In conclusion, playing beer games with policies and without policies will make many significant differences. If we play it without using policies, it will have a bigger cost because there's no limit for the maximum stock and the maximum backlog. Besides that, if we play it with policies, it will have a smaller cost because several policies will limiting the stock and the backlog. So with policies, expensive costs from excess stock and excess backlog will be avoided. Next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the backlog number should be directly proportional with the outgoing order? For instance, that if the backlog is high, therefore the order going to be high, right? But in here, the tolerance for the backlog, for instance, for rounds 21 to 40 should be below 40. So you are increasing the tolerance of the backlog. However, you are decreasing the tolerance of your maximum outgoing order. Could you explain that, Nicholas?
Yes, so we actually increased the tolerance. So as I mentioned before, our main purpose now in the second game where we implement these policies is to make sure that the bullet effect doesn't become too strong, because of this bullet effect that in the first game everything went out of control at some point. So we increase the tolerance of the backlog rounds because we know the bullet effect, no matter how much we try to control it, will eventually become more prominent as time progresses. That much we already know.
Okay.
That's why we increase the tolerance as the time goes on for the round. However, it is still in yes.
Now, I think that's all for my question. Thank you for your participation during this presentation. Okay, I think good job to you guys.